All right, so we're going to do a deep dive into Brené Brown's Dare to Lead today. You sent over some really interesting stuff. I'm excited to kind of dig into this with you. This book really explores courage in leadership
Yeah.
and how that relates to building a culture where everybody feels empowered to show up authentically. So I think that's something that a lot of people are craving these days. What I found really fascinating is that Brown kind of dives into some unexpected territory. We're going to be exploring how vulnerability, which is something that a lot of leaders try to hide, is actually the foundation for courageous leadership. We'll also get into some ideas about the power of play at work
Mm,
and why sometimes knowing less can actually make you a more effective leader. So are you ready to rumble with this?
absolutely. Brown really challenges conventional leadership thinking.
Mhm.
And she doesn't pretend that leadership is easy. And sometimes it requires us to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah. She opens the book with that really funny story
Mm,
about speaking at a sea-level conference and thinking that sea level meant sea level, like down-to-earth folks. And it's really funny because it illustrates how a lot of us, even at the highest levels, struggle with embracing vulnerability. But she makes the point that vulnerability is not weakness. It's the birthplace of courage, innovation, and connection.
exactly. And one of the things that I really appreciate about her work is that she's not advocating that we just sort of unleash vulnerability haphazardly. Remember the story about that young CEO
Hmm.
who tried to implement vulnerability by having everybody drink the Kool-Aid and overshare personal
Oh, yeah,
details?
that backfired
It
spectacularly.
did. He missed the point entirely. It's not about emotional dumping. It's about being strategic with vulnerability
Mhm.
and understanding that vulnerability without boundaries can actually be harmful.
So, how do we find that sweet spot, that balance between being open and maintaining healthy boundaries? How do we rumble with vulnerability effectively?
That's where Brown's 4 skill sets of courageous leadership come in. She calls them rumbling with vulnerability, living into our values, braving trust, and learning to rise. And what I find really empowering about that is that those are skills. And skills can be developed. They're not personality traits that you're stuck with.
Okay, let's break this down a little bit. Starting with rumbling with vulnerability. I think a lot of us, we've been conditioned to see vulnerability as a weakness, especially in professional settings. So, how do we start to shift that mindset?
Well, Brown defines vulnerability as showing up when you can't control the outcome. So think about it. If you're pitching a new idea, or you're asking for a promotion, or you're having a difficult conversation with a colleague, none of those scenarios have a guaranteed outcome. But we still have to show up. And that's vulnerability in action.
So, I'm seeing the connection now between vulnerability and courage. Because it does take courage to put yourself out there
Yeah,
when you don't know what's going to happen.
exactly. And it also dispels this myth that trust has to come before vulnerability. She uses the analogy of the marble jar
Oh, I love that analogy.
to illustrate how trust is built.
Yeah, it's so
In
good.
small moments, not grand gestures.
Yeah, it's those small everyday actions that really build trust over time.
Right. Think about it. Who are the people that you trust the most? It's likely those who show up consistently, who remember little things about you, who are reliable and accountable. Trust is built in those small moments of connection, like remembering a colleague's child's name or offering support when they're going through a tough time.
So, if we're trying to cultivate a culture of courage in our own workplaces, what are some practical steps we can take to start to encourage that rumbling with vulnerability?
Well, I think it starts with modeling it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
As leaders, what are some ways that you can demonstrate vulnerability in your leadership role? Maybe it's admitting when you don't know something or asking for feedback on your performance.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's about creating a space where it's okay to be human, to not have it all figured out.
Right. And I think another important piece of this is acknowledging and celebrating those small moments of vulnerability from our team members. If someone speaks up in a meeting with a new idea or admits to making a mistake, if we recognize and appreciate those moments, it reinforces the message that vulnerability is valued.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like creating a feedback loop that
Got it.
encourages more of those behaviors. But how do we address those times when vulnerability is confused with oversharing? How do we help people understand the importance of boundaries?
That's where clear communication and setting expectations come in. It's helpful to create guidelines for what's appropriate to share at work, emphasizing that vulnerability is not about spilling your deepest, darkest secrets. It's about being authentic and connecting with others in a meaningful way.
And creating a safe space where people feel comfortable sharing their ideas and their perspectives without fear of judgment or reprisal.
Absolutely. So we've talked about embracing vulnerability, but how does this tie into living into our values? that second seal set in Brown's framework.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that. How do we move beyond just identifying our values to actually embodying them,
It's like
especially in the workplace?
one of the key points that Brown makes is that we don't have separate personal and professional values. Our values are an integrated part of who we are, and they should inform our actions in all aspects of our lives.
That's a relief to hear. I always struggled with that. Trying to come up with separate sets of values for work and life, it felt very inauthentic.
It isn't authentic. It's about integrating them into everything we do.
Yeah.
And it's not just about identifying them, it's about living them out, even when it's hard.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of us get tripped up. It's one thing to say I value integrity, but it's another thing to actually act with integrity in those moments where it might be easier to take a shortcut or to look the other way.
Absolutely. And Brown is very transparent about her own struggles with this. She shares a story about grappling with her value of finding the face of God in everyone, particularly during challenging political times.
Yeah, that really resonated with me. It's so easy to get caught up in that us versus them mentality, and it takes real courage to hold on to our values of compassion and understanding when we're faced with opposing viewpoints.
It does. And it's a good example of how living into our values is not about being perfect. It's about striving for congruence between what we believe and how we act. It's about showing up authentically, even when it's uncomfortable.
So where do we even begin with figuring out our own values and then operationalizing them in the workplace?
I think you start small. Think about one or two values that really resonate with you, the ones that guide your actions and decisions, even when nobody's watching. And then ask yourself, how am I living into these values at work? Where am I falling short? And what's one small step I can take today to close that gap?
So it's like a constant check-in, a way of holding ourselves accountable, not in a way that beats us up when we mess up, but in a way that helps us learn from those experiences and make a conscious effort to do better next time. Exactly. It's a process of self-reflection and course correction that's really key to living into our values authentically and courageously.
Yeah, I love that. And I think what we're talking about here is really building a foundation for trust, which is so essential for any kind of healthy team dynamics. And it's interesting because Brown introduces this really cool tool called the Braving Inventory, which is like a checklist for assessing and building trust.
Yeah, it's an acronym. And each of the letters stands for a different element of trust.
Okay, so I remember you mentioning this earlier, but I'd love to hear more about it. What does Braving stand for?
Okay, so B is for boundaries. R is for reliability, A is for accountability, V is for vault, I is for integrity, N is for non-judgment, and G is for generosity.
Okay, that's quite a list. How do we actually use this inventory to build trust in a practical way?
Okay, so let's imagine that you're facing a situation where trust feels a little shaky within your team. Maybe there's been a miscommunication or a missed deadline, and people are starting to feel a little resentful or suspicious. Oh yeah, that's a scenario I think a lot of us can relate to. It's easy for trust to erode when things go wrong.
Right. So instead of letting those feelings fester, you can use the Braving Inventory to facilitate a conversation. You might start by asking your team, okay, what does boundaries look like in our team dynamics? Are we clear about our roles and responsibilities? Do we respect each other's time and energy?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. It opens up a dialogue about those fundamental expectations and boundaries. They're so essential for healthy collaboration.
Exactly. And then you can move on to reliability. Are we consistent in our actions? Do we follow through on our commitments?
This one can be tricky, especially when we're all juggling multiple priorities and deadlines. It's about being honest with ourselves and with each other, about what we can realistically handle.
Right. Then there's accountability. Do we own our mistakes and make amends when we mess up? Do we avoid blaming others or making excuses?
This one can be tough, but it's so important for building that culture of trust. When we see people owning up to their mistakes and taking responsibility, it reinforces the sense that we're all in this together.
Exactly. Then we have Volt. Do we respect confidentiality and handle sensitive information with discretion?
This is so crucial, especially in today's world, where information travels so quickly. If people don't feel like they can trust you to keep things confidential, it's going to be very difficult to build strong relationships.
Right. Then we have integrity. Do we act in alignment with our values and principles, even when nobody's watching?
That's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. Then we have non-judgment. Do we approach each other with empathy and understanding, rather than criticism and judgment?
This can be a tough one, especially in a work environment where we're often evaluating performance, but it's so important to create a space where people feel safe to be vulnerable and to make mistakes without fear of being shamed or ridiculed.
Absolutely. And finally, there's generosity. Do we give each other the benefit of the doubt? Do we assume positive intent?
Yeah, that's about choosing to see the best in people, even when they mess up, recognizing that everybody is doing the best they can with the resources and knowledge they have at that moment.
Exactly. So by using the braving inventory as a framework for discussion, you can really start to pinpoint those specific areas where trust might be weak, and then you can co-create strategies for strengthening those areas.
That's so helpful. It's a much more concrete and actionable approach
Hmm.
than just talking about trust in these vague terms.
Right. And I think the process of having those conversations in itself can be a really powerful trust-building exercise because it shows that you're willing to be vulnerable, to acknowledge the challenges, and to work together to find solutions.
Yeah, I love that. It's about creating that shared understanding and a commitment to building trust as a team.
Exactly. And this ties into the next skill set in Brown's framework, learning to rise.
Okay, learning to rise. What does that entail?
It's about developing resilience and the ability to bounce back from setbacks and failures.
I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with, especially in a work environment where failure is often seen as a sign of weakness.
Right. And Brown really challenges that notion. She argues that failure is an essential part of growth and learning.
But how do we actually learn from our failures? It's so easy to get caught up in self-blame and shame when things go wrong.
Well, she encourages us to get curious about what she calls our shitty first drafts, or SFDs, which are basically the stories that we make up in the absence of data.
Oh yeah, those SFDs can be brutal.
They can.
Yeah,
And they can really spiral out of control
they can,
if we let them.
if we let it.
But the key is to recognize them for what they are. They're stories, not facts. So the next time you find yourself spiraling into self-doubt or blame, try asking yourself, what's the story I'm making up right now? What are the facts? And what more do I need to learn and understand?
That's such a helpful strategy. It's about pausing and taking a step back before we get swept away by those negative thought patterns.
Exactly. And once we've identified the story, then we can start to challenge it. Brown suggests asking ourselves these three questions. Is this story true? Is it helpful? And is it kind?
Oh, I love those questions.
They're so simple,
They're so simple.
but they're so powerful.
Yeah, it's like a reality check for our own thoughts.
It is. And if the story isn't true, helpful, or kind, then we can start to rewrite it. We can choose to focus on the facts, look for the lessons in our failures, and treat ourselves with compassion and understanding.
This is starting to feel like a whole new approach to dealing with setbacks and challenges. It's not about beating ourselves up or avoiding failure at all costs. It's about embracing it as an opportunity for growth.
Exactly. And she uses that hilarious personal anecdote about what she calls the ham fold-over debacle
Oh, yeah, I love that story.
to really bring this concept to life.
It was so funny, but it also made such a powerful point about how our SFDs can hijack our emotions and create all this unnecessary drama.
It's a perfect example of how the stories we tell ourselves can create so much suffering. But by recognizing and challenging those stories, we can rewrite the narrative and create a more positive and productive outcome.
So we've covered vulnerability values, trust, and learning to rise. These are some really powerful tools for courageous leadership. But I think a lot of people struggle with feeling confident, especially in leadership roles, where there's so much pressure to have all the answers. How does Brown address this idea of confidence?
Well, she introduces the concept of grounded confidence, which is a type of confidence that's not based on arrogance or bravado, but rather on self-awareness practice and a willingness to learn from our mistakes.
So it's not about pretending to have it all figured out. It's about being comfortable with not knowing everything and being open to growth.
Exactly. And she uses the analogy of pool and soccer to illustrate this point.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do pool and soccer relate to grounded confidence?
Well, think about the fundamental skills in both sports. In pool, it's perfecting your stroke. In soccer, it's mastering ball control. And players practice those skills relentlessly until they become second nature.
So that when they're in the game, they can trust their foundation and focus on strategy and decision-making.
Precisely. And it's the same with leadership, those fundamental skills. Rumbling with vulnerability, living into our values, braving trust, learning to rise. Those are what allow us to show up with that grounded confidence.
It's about practicing those skills until they become ingrained in our way of being, so we can navigate challenges with more ease and grace.
Exactly. And it takes time and effort and a healthy dose of curiosity.
Curiosity keeps us open to new possibilities. It helps us challenge our assumptions and it allows us to learn from our mistakes. It's like a superpower in the world of leadership.
It is. And it helps us move away from what Brown calls armored leadership behaviors, which can be so detrimental to creating a culture of courage.
Oh, yes, those armored leadership behaviors. We touched on those earlier. Can we dive a little deeper into what those look like and how
No,
to
that's-
address them?
Absolutely. One of the most common armored leadership behaviors is perfectionism.
Oh, I know that one all too well. It's like this constant pressure to be flawless, to never make a mistake.
Right. And Brown emphasizes that perfectionism isn't about striving for excellence. It's about trying to earn approval and avoid shame. It's driven by fear.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to protect ourselves from judgment and criticism by being perfect. But the irony is that perfectionism actually sets us up for more shame because it's an impossible standard to meet.
Exactly. So how do we break free from this perfectionism trap? Well, Brown suggests focusing on progress, not perfection. It's about celebrating our wins, learning from our mistakes,
Right.
and embracing the messy process of growth.
That's a much more realistic and compassionate approach. It's about letting go of the need to be perfect and allowing ourselves to be human. But what about those times when we see perfectionism rearing its head in our team members? How do we address that?
Well, I think it starts with creating a culture where mistakes are seen as opportunities for learning, not as failures. It's about modeling that ourselves and encouraging our team members to embrace a growth mindset.
So it's about shifting the focus from being right to learning and growing.
Exactly. It's also about recognizing and challenging those perfectionistic beliefs that can be so deeply ingrained.
Like the belief that our worth is tied to our performance.
Precisely. We need to remind ourselves and our team members that our worthiness is inherent. It's not something that we have to earn through flawless performance.
That's such a powerful reminder. I think we all need to hear that message more often.
I agree. And speaking of messages that need to be heard, let's talk about another armored leadership behavior, numbing.
Numbing. That's something we all do to some extent, right? Especially when we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed.
Absolutely. Brown describes numbing as any activity that we use to avoid uncomfortable emotions or situations. This could include things like overworking, overeating, excessive drinking, or spending too much time on social media.
It's like we're trying to escape from the discomfort of our own lives.
Precisely. And the problem is that numbing doesn't actually address the underlying issues. It just creates a temporary distraction. So how do we break free from these numbing patterns?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so easy to get caught in those cycles of avoidance.
Well, she encourages us to get curious about our numbing behaviors
Yeah.
and find healthier ways to cope with stress and discomfort. What are some things that you do to recharge and take care of yourself?
Well, I've been trying to be more intentional about incorporating exercise and meditation into my routine and spending time in nature.
Those are all great examples. It's about finding those activities that nourish our bodies, minds, and souls, rather than those that numb us out and disconnect us from our true selves.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that self-care isn't selfish. It's essential for our well-being and our ability to show up fully in our lives and our work.
Absolutely. And speaking of showing up fully, let's talk about another armored leadership behavior that can be particularly insidious: cynicism.
Ugh, cynicism. It's like a negativity that spreads like wildfire and just sucks the life out of everything. I've definitely worked in environments where cynicism was rampant and it was so draining.
It is draining. And Brown describes cynicism as a defense mechanism,
Hmm.
a way for protecting ourselves from disappointment and hurt.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're saying, I'm not going to get my hopes up, so I won't be let down.
Right. It's a way of shielding ourselves from vulnerability, but it ends up creating distance and disconnection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we combat cynicism, both in ourselves and in our teams?
That's the million-dollar question. It can feel so contagious.
It can. And Brown suggests cultivating gratitude and focusing on the positive aspects of our lives and our work. It's about choosing to see the good, even in the midst of challenges. What's one thing you're grateful for today?
Well, I'm grateful for this conversation. It's so inspiring to dive into these ideas and to think about how we can apply them to create a more courageous and compassionate work environment.
That's a great example. And it highlights the power of shifting our focus from what's wrong to what's right. Even in the midst of challenges, there are always things to be grateful for.
That's a great reminder. But what about when we're dealing with people who are chronically cynical? How do we address that?
I think it starts with setting clear expectations and boundaries. It's okay to say, we appreciate your perspective, but we're committed to creating a positive and supportive work environment. So let's focus on solutions and possibilities rather than dwelling on the negative.
Yeah, that's a great way to reframe the conversation. It's about acknowledging their perspective,
Right.
but also redirecting the energy towards something more constructive.
Exactly. And it's also about modeling that positive and hopeful attitude ourselves. Our energy is contagious.
That's so true. Okay, so we've talked about perfectionism, numbing, and cynicism. What are some other armored leadership behaviors we should be aware of?
Well, another big one is control.
Control. Yeah, that's a big one, especially in leadership roles, where we often feel this pressure to be in charge and have all the answers. I've definitely struggled with that myself.
I think we all do. Brown describes control as a way of trying to manage uncertainty and avoid feeling vulnerable. It's like we're saying, if I can just control everything, then I'll be safe.
But of course, that's an illusion. We can't control everything, and trying to do so just creates a lot of stress and anxiety.
Exactly. And it can also stifle creativity, innovation, and collaboration.
Yeah.
So how do we loosen our grip on control and embrace a more empowering approach to leadership?
Yeah, that's what I'm eager to learn. It feels so counterintuitive to let go of control, especially when we're in a leadership position.
It does. And Brown suggests that we need to cultivate trust. Trust in ourselves
Yeah.
and trust in others.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that we don't have to have all the answers, that it's okay to ask for help, and that we can empower our team members to take ownership and make decisions.
Exactly.
Mm.
And she also suggests focusing on what we can control rather than what we can't.
Okay, so instead of trying to micromanage every detail, we might focus on setting clear expectations, providing support and resources, and creating a positive and encouraging work environment.
Precisely. It's about creating the conditions for success and then trusting our team members to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, I love that. It's about shifting our energy from trying to control everything to empowering our team members to do their best work.
Exactly. And this leads into another armored leadership behavior that can be especially damaging, leading from hurt.
Oh, this one hits close to home. I know I've fallen into this trap in the past, especially when I've been feeling insecure or threatened.
I think we all have. Brown describes leading from hurt as using our position of power to punish, control, or manipulate others. It's often driven by unresolved emotional wounds from our past. And it can manifest in behaviors like blaming, shaming, or withholding information.
It's like we're taking out our pain and frustration on others.
Precisely. And it's never a healthy or effective way to lead. So how do we break free from this pattern?
Yeah, that's what I'm grappling with. It's so easy to fall back into those old patterns, especially when we're feeling triggered.
It is. And Brown encourages us to do the inner work of healing those emotional wounds from our past. This might involve therapy journaling or other forms of self-exploration and reflection.
It's about recognizing those patterns and then taking responsibility for addressing them rather than projecting them onto others.
Exactly. And it's also about cultivating self-compassion and empathy.
It's about learning to treat ourselves and others with kindness and understanding, even when we mess up.
Precisely. And when we lead from a place of compassion and empathy, we're less likely to lash out or try to control others, or more likely to create a work environment that is supportive, encouraging, and empowering.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. It's about recognizing that hurt people, and healed people heal people.
Exactly. And speaking of healing, let's talk about another armored leadership behavior that can be particularly toxic: weaponizing fear and uncertainty.
Ooh, that one sounds scary.
It can be. Brown describes this behavior as using fear and intimidation to control others. This can involve creating a culture of fear, withholding information, or using threats and ultimatums to get people to comply.
Yeah, it's like a bullying tactic, using fear to manipulate and control others.
Precisely. And it's never a sustainable or effective way to lead. So how do we create a culture of courage rather than a culture of fear?
That's the question I think we all need to be asking ourselves,
Yeah.
especially in today's world where there's so much uncertainty and anxiety.
Absolutely. And Brown emphasizes the importance of this: transparency, honesty, and open communication. It's about creating a safe space where people feel comfortable speaking up, sharing their ideas,
I know.
and asking questions without fear of reprisal.
Yeah, it's about fostering that sense of psychological safety where people feel like they can be themselves and take risks without being punished for it.
Exactly. And it's also about building trust and connection. It's about creating a sense of belonging and shared purpose, rather than a climate of fear and intimidation.
Yeah, this resonates with me so much. It's about moving away from that command and control model of leadership and embracing a more collaborative and empowering approach.
Exactly. And when we lead from a place of trust and connection, we create much more positive and productive work environment.
Okay, so we've unpacked some of those armored leadership behaviors. Perfectionism, numbing cynicism, control leading from hurt, and weaponizing fear and uncertainty. What are some practical strategies?
So for some practical strategies for addressing these behaviors both in ourselves and in others,
Okay.
Brown offers this really helpful concept called rumble starters.
Rumble starters.
Yeah,
What are those?
basically they're phrases or questions that we can use to initiate crucial conversations. Well, vulnerability, trust, and courage are kind of like conversation prompts that help us get the ball rolling on these sometimes awkward or challenging dialogues.
That sounds incredibly useful. Can you give us some examples of rumble starters?
Sure. One of my favorites is, the story I'm making up is, this goes back to challenging those shitty first drafts and getting curious about the stories we're telling ourselves.
Okay, so for example, if I'm feeling really stressed out about a project, I might say to myself, the story I'm making up is that I'm not capable of handling this, I'm going to fail, and everyone's going to judge me.
Exactly. And then you can start to unpack that story. Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it kind of...
Right. And then I can start to reframe the situation. Maybe the story I need to be telling myself is, this is a challenging project, but I have the skills and resources to handle it. I'm going to do my best. And even if things don't go perfectly, it's an opportunity to learn and grow.
Exactly. That's a great example of how rumble starters can help us shift our perspective and move from fear to courage.
I love that. What are some other rumble starters we can use?
If you're sensing a lack of trust within a team, you might try, what does the braving inventory look like in our team dynamics? This opens up a dialogue about those essential elements of trust.
That's a great one. It provides a framework for a really constructive conversation about trust. What about when we want to encourage healthy striving and celebrate wins?
You might try something like, what are we celebrating? And how can we amplify this success? It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day grind and forget to acknowledge and appreciate those moments of success.
I love that. It's about creating a culture of appreciation and recognizing the contributions of our team members. What about those times when we see those armored leadership behaviors creeping in, like cynicism or negativity?
You could try. What's one thing we can do to shift the energy in this room? It's about creating a more positive and hopeful atmosphere, even in the midst of challenges.
Yeah, it's about reframing the conversation and focusing on solutions rather than problems.
Exactly. And rumble starters can also be used to encourage self-awareness and reflection. So you might try something like, what do you need to stay in your integrity?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's about reminding ourselves and others of the importance of living in alignment with our values, even when it's hard.
Precisely. And the beauty of rumble starters is that they're adaptable and customizable. You can use them in team meetings, one-on-one conversations, or even in your own personal reflections. It's like having a toolbox of communication strategies for navigating those tricky interpersonal dynamics. That can make or break a team.
And the more we practice using these rumble starters, the more comfortable and confident we become in having those crucial conversations about vulnerability, trust, and courage.
Exactly. It's about building that muscle memory for courageous leadership, one conversation at a time.
This has been so incredibly insightful. I'm feeling inspired and empowered to incorporate these ideas into my own leadership style.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. We're all learning and growing, and it's okay to make mistakes along the way.
Yeah, that's so reassuring. I think a lot of us put so much pressure on ourselves to be these perfect leaders, and that can be really paralyzing.
It can. And that's why Brown's message of courage and vulnerability is so important. It's about giving ourselves permission to be human, to embrace our imperfections, and to show up authentically, even when it's scary.
It's about leading with our hearts, not just our heads.
Exactly. And speaking of leading with our hearts, let's talk about the importance of rest, play, and recovery in preventing burnout and maintaining our well-being.
Oh, this is something I definitely need to work on. I tend to push myself really hard, and I often end up feeling exhausted and depleted.
I think a lot of us do, and Brown emphasizes that. Rest, play, and recovery aren't luxuries. They're essentials. For our physical, emotional, and mental health, it's like giving ourselves permission to recharge our batteries and to engage in activities that bring us joy and renewal.
So it's about making self-care a priority, not an afterthought.
Precisely. And she also suggests challenging those societal messages that tell us that busyness and productivity are the only measures of worth. It's about rejecting that hustle culture mentality and embracing a more balanced and holistic approach to life and work. What are some ways that you incorporate play and recovery into your life?
Well, I've recently rediscovered the joy of reading for pleasure. It's such a great way to escape from the stresses of the day and to immerse myself in a different world. I've also been trying to make more time for creative pursuits like painting and writing, which I used to love. I kind of neglected for years.
Those are all wonderful examples. It's about reconnecting with those activities that bring us joy and spark our creativity. And it's about giving ourselves permission to rest and recharge without guilt or shame.
Yeah, it's about recognizing
Right.
that we can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly.
Mm.
And when we prioritize our well-being, we're better able to show up fully in our lives and our work, and to lead with more energy, enthusiasm, and compassion.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I'm feeling so inspired to step into my own leadership journey with more intention, authenticity, and courage.
That's wonderful to hear. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. We're all works in progress, and that's okay.
Absolutely. And Brown reminds us that the most important thing is to keep showing up, keep learning, and keep striving to be the best leaders we can be.
I love that. It's about embracing the journey and celebrating those small wins along the way.
So for those of you listening who are feeling inspired to dive deeper into these ideas, I highly recommend checking out Brené Brown's book, Dare to Lead. It's full of practical tools and strategies for cultivating courage and building a culture of vulnerability in your own life and work. So until next time, keep daring greatly.
So welcome back. We've been having a great conversation about Brené Brown's Dare to Lead. And I'm amazed at how many different facets there are
Yeah.
to this whole concept of courageous leadership. Yeah, it really is multifaceted. And one of the things that strikes me is how it really boiled down to creating a culture where everybody feels empowered to show up authentically,
Mm-hmm.
to take risks,
Mm-hmm.
and to embrace vulnerability.
Yeah, it's about building that psychological safety net that allows people to be their best selves without fear of judgment or reprisal.
Exactly. And this ties into the idea of creating a brave space, which Brown talks about in the book.
A brave space, I love that term. What does that look like in a practical sense?
Well, think of it as an environment where people feel safe to speak their truth, to share their ideas, and to challenge the status quo, even if their perspectives are different. It's about creating a culture of respect, curiosity, and openness, where everyone feels heard and valued.
So it's not just about tolerating differences, it's about actively seeking them out and valuing them as a source of strength and innovation.
Exactly. Brown emphasizes that we need to move away from that binary us versus them mentality and embrace the richness and complexity of multiple perspectives. She even uses the term ideological bunkers to describe those echo chambers, where we only surround ourselves with people who agree with us.
Oh, those ideological bunkers can be so tempting, especially in today's world, where it's so easy to filter our news feeds and our social media to only show us what we want to see. But I can see how that limits our growth and prevents us from truly understanding and connecting with people who are different from us.
Exactly. And that's why Brown emphasizes the importance of rumbling with those who hold different perspectives. It's about engaging in respectful dialogue, listening with empathy, and seeking to understand, even if we don't agree.
That can be so challenging, especially when we're dealing with those hot button issues that tend to trigger such strong emotional reactions.
It can, but Brown argues that it's essential for building a more just and equitable world. And it starts with being willing to step outside of our comfort zones and to engage in those uncomfortable conversations.
Right. It's about recognizing that discomfort is often a sign of growth and learning.
Exactly. And this ties into the concept of daring leadership,
Yeah.
which is really the core theme of Brown's book.
Daring leadership. You know, I love that phrase. I think it really encapsulates so much of what we've been talking about. Embracing vulnerability, living into our values, building trust, and creating those brave spaces.
It does. And it's about recognizing that leadership isn't about having all the answers or being the loudest voice in the room. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels empowered to contribute their unique
Yeah.
talents and perspectives.
It's about leading with our hearts, not just our heads.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that true leadership is often found in those quiet acts of courage, those moments when we choose to speak up, to stand up for what we believe in, and to show up authentically, even when it's scary.
This has been such an inspiring deep dive into the world of daring leadership. I'm feeling so energized and motivated to put these principles into practice in my own life and work.
That's wonderful to hear. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. We're all learning and growing. And the most important thing is to keep showing up, to keep practicing those courage skills, and to keep believing in the power of daring leadership to transform our lives and our world.
Beautiful. Those are some wise words to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. And to all of you listening, we hope you gain some valuable insights and tools for leading with more courage, compassion, and heart. Until next time, keep daring greatly.